As someone who grew up on hip-hop and loves hip-hop, he's not the best. His political content is zero. In fact, he's anti-woman, anti-struggle, anti-progressiveness. But I am a man, like anybody else, wrapped up in many hypocrisies and contradictions. Like we were talking earlier, being born in Washington, D.C. Has sort of imposed on me the permanent love for this racist football team that not only has a tradition of racism in its name and its history and its founder, but can't seem to win a game in 20 years. So, but nonetheless, there's another contradiction. So, I want to start off by responding to a comment made about me on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! At the end of last year, where she, I'm not big enough to be invited on the show, but I did have something I wrote quoted to Dr. Vincent Harding, who is, among many other things, a former speechwriter of Dr. King, and who has overseen the reissue, very importantly, of Dr. King's last full-length book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, which I would like to offer just very quickly, that no one who speaks publicly about Dr. King, regardless of their age, regardless of their claims to knowledge, regardless of their claims having marched with him, nobody should ever speak publicly about Dr. King unless they've read that book. And I think we need to advocate and push for this as an actual sort of movement. That if you haven't read that book, and if you don't address the content of that book, then you really should not have anything else to say about Dr. King. You should really keep your name out of your mouth. Because it so clearly outlines where he was going at the end of his life. So to allow people to continue to distort his image and his history ignorantly and dangerously is a real struggle that I have, and I want to encourage that you all take up. And if any of you have not read that book, you should read it immediately, because it will almost as immediately as you pick it up begin to challenge what you thought you knew about Dr. King. And will in many ways shock you into a version of the man that you've probably never been encouraged to come across. So anyway, Amy Goodman asked, she said to Dr. Harding, I want to end with she said, I'm looking at a piece from the Black Agenda Report by Jared Ball, who said, referring to corporate sponsors, of course, talking about the memorial that they put up in D.C., this abomination, this is a horrific injustice. And she says, basically, she asked, what does he think about the fact that I've said that we should be critical of the people who paid for and sponsored the memorial? And his response was, well, I would like to comment on that, especially to remind us that in this country, this democracy that we're trying to create was sponsored by slave owners, and slave traders. But that does not mean that that was the end of the story. As our great African-American teacher, who was one of our major Supreme Court justices, reminds us, that though the country began in that way, we could go on to create something new. I'm not worried right now about who paid for the memorial. What I want to do and what I want to know is how the memorial in the spirit of the King can be remade, can be taken over into our hands and carried on to the point where we can get past the concerns that King had for racism, for materialism, for militarism. Those were the three major concerns as his life ended. If we can take that on at this point in history, then whoever paid for the monument does not matter. We are the ones who will have to create the meaning of Dr. King for the future of this country, end quote. Much of that I agree with, except for the fact, as I'll get to in just a minute here, that we do have to pay attention to who pays for things, who sponsors things, because they have a political purpose, they have an ideology and a worldview they are trying to uphold by the sponsorship. And to the extent that I can assume just by the lack of response that there has been no groundswell of revolutionary activity since the memorial was put up. There has been no groundswell of activity to revisit the real Dr. King and to radically politically organize around the real Dr. King. So I would argue that the sponsors have won. But my point is, and I'll say this now, and I know that generally we don't have time for Q&A, but I think I'll be finished in time to maybe entertain one or two questions if you all are open to that. I generally like the dialogue. But anyway, the dedication of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. was a quintessential display of a guided board called spectacle. In his words, what we refer to as media is really the communication of orders, whereby those who give them are those who tell us what These orders, the board said, permeate all reality and form a crushing presence so as to assure that no place is left where people can discuss the realities which concern them. And by so doing, we are left with the only unanswerable lies which have succeeded in eliminating public opinion. In fact, the board says the spectacle is the end of history, which have succeeded in eliminating public opinion. In fact, the board says the spectacle such displays as we witnessed during the ceremony operate under the orders of ending critical thought and radical reflection and gave us a parade of characters which the board says are the experts who serve the state and the media, and only in that way do we achieve their status. Do they achieve their status, rather? So my point is essentially this, that when you look at who sponsors this memorial, and if we look at, in fact, what a memorial's function in a state is supposed to be, we see that General Motors and Bank of America and Walmart and Boeing and Pfizer, who, by the way, just had to recall their birth control bills, so I'm just saying. It might be... My wife and I were doing, there could be a lot of little fizzles running around in about 9 months. Fizzle my missiles, Pfizer, yeah. Tommy Hilfiger and AT&T. Now, of course, why would they want to sponsor this memorial about Dr. King? A man who gave his life struggling against the very corporate, militarist, and warmongering entities that would all coalesce to have him assassinated. And by the way, let me just, because I know time is short, let me just do this a little differently. Since we're talking about media a little bit, it should be of great concern to people that what should be known as the trial of the century, which at this point I think is still the OJ trial now, I think that's supplanted the Lindbergh kidnapping of earlier. But really the trial of the century should have been what took place in December of 1999, where a Memphis jury of 6 blacks and 6 whites concluded that Dr. King was assassinated, quote, by a conspiracy involving Boyd Jowers and others, including government agencies, end quote. What they did after hearing evidence from Dr. William Pepper, who was a longtime confidant and friend of Dr. King, when they heard the evidence into what actually took place that day, April 4th, 1968, and realized the array of government agencies that were all monitoring, following, and waiting to see what would happen to Dr. King, and depending on who you listen to, actually advocating that he be killed. After hearing this evidence, this jury recognized and ruled that what we think we know of the assassination of Dr. King is a myth. It's an absolute false lie. And in fact, I was in a room probably a little smaller than this when Judge Joe Brown, who many of you know from his television show, was actually, at the time, supposed to have been the judge of the retrial of James R.E.A.L. And he said unequivocally, after looking at the evidence, in particular the rifle that they said was used to kill Dr. King, that this was not the rifle, that this story does not work. So even someone as famous as Judge Joe Brown has said publicly on a number of occasions that what we think we know of this assassination is a mythology, is a lie, and in fact is much more deep and much more conspiratorial. And by the way, just to, demystify this term conspiracy, conspiracy just simply is 2 or more people getting together to do something that is illegal. And, many of us may have been involved in a conspiracy before we even got here today. So the idea that somehow people who achieve status, power, money, and wealth would not engage in those same kinds of things is, I think, foolish. And on this one, I actually agree with Noam Chomsky, whose argument is that we are encouraged to dismiss conspiracy theories because the phrase itself encourages us not to engage in institutional analysis. So what happens if we engage in an institutional analysis? In another presentation that I've given sometimes, I look at the Washington Post headlines just covering Dr. King from 1965 when he was nominated for Man of the Year to 1968 when he was, of course, assassinated. And you can use these headlines to trace how Dr. King lost popularity as he gained political radicalism. So he goes from Man of the Year. Then in 1966, of course, the FBI put together the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, which, anybody see Clint Eastwood's movie on J. Edgar? Oh, good. Oh, good. Nobody saw it. Oh, that's what's up. That's very good. because that movie is, you talk about an abomination and anti-history. Oh, this is really good. I'm really glad that not one hand went up. Not only does that film not mention the counterintelligence program, not only does that film not mention any black radicals at all, not only does it not mention that Hoover wanted to destroy Garvey and the Black Panther Party, among many other good and well-meaning organizations and other activists from other communities, but he only shows in the film Dr. King as sort of a pornographic background as Hoover is listening to the tapes of King having his, one of his many affairs, which he did have as public record. It's not controversial to say that. But what it is always important to remind people of is that he was not assassinated because he cheated on R.E.A.L. And he was not assassinated because he allegedly cheated on his PhD. And many of the people who have monuments in D.C., along with him are far worse, and were asked to forgive their slaveholding, their anti-women beliefs, and their anti-poor people beliefs, and we're supposed to let all that go because of some greatness that they allegedly engaged in. But when it comes to Dr. King, we're supposed to say, oh, forget his politics, that man, I had a dream, cheated on R.E.A.L, and that was all good, and he got shot, and that was it. So in 1966, COINTELPRO was developed. And in that, one of the things that it says, among many others, is that Dr. King, Malcolm X, they said, would have been the martyr. The goal of the counterintelligence program, as they said, vis-a-vis black American radical groups, is to prevent the rise of a black messiah, as they said, who might unify and electrify the black masses. And they said Malcolm X was the martyr. And later in their documents, they more or less claim credit for having set the conditions that got Malcolm killed. Then they also said, we have to watch out for a number of other people. Dr. King is one of them. If, as it says, he gives up his supposed allegiance to nonviolence and liberalism, he will become the next threat that we have to watch out for. And then they also had Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture on the list, and then they had Elijah Muhammad on the list. So as you go through the Washington Post headlines, you not only see that in 1965, King is a Man of the Year candidate. In 1966, he starts doing things like spending summers in Chicago, and where he realizes that a lot of what he had been engaged in the South was insufficient. He said that in the North, they've long had the right to vote, but that doesn't guarantee them a job. It doesn't guarantee them health care. It doesn't guarantee that they won't be beaten by police. And it won't guarantee that they have a good education, good food to eat. So he said we need to ramp up the struggle, which included a lot of really crazy things that have nothing to do with today, like taking over projects and collecting rents from poor people and then saying we're not going to pay the slumlord, we're going to use their rent money to actually fix up their community. I mean, I know that has no relevance today because everything is all good. But that was just something that he did that could be a nice standard for determining the people who claim to follow King's legacy today. And there are a whole bunch of them. And during that memorial spectacle, Andy Young and Jesse Jackson played that role beautifully. And of course, none other than, I'm glad the brother did it before me, that I don't have to be the first to be critical of Obama. But Obama has been the perfect actor in simultaneously claiming the King legacy while doing damn near everything that would be anti-King in terms of his policy. Number one of which was mentioned by the brother in that spoken word piece is spending more on the military than Bush did, and Reagan and the other president behind him. Predator drone strikes. Right now, somebody's probably being killed by remote control at the request of our current president. Bombing Africa, can't do that. That's hot right there. Black man gets around and bombs the continent from which he comes. That's what's up. His stance on Israel-Palestine has been jacked up. He doesn't mention poor people. Doesn't say the word poverty. He focuses only on the middle class. I can go on and on. But he accepts a Nobel Peace Prize on the hope as the. Did you want to hear that? Did you all hear the speech that the dude that the Nobel Peace Prize said when he gave the thing to Obama? And he said, I know he hadn't done anything yet, but this is the hope that he will do something to earn this prize later. That is deep. So I told my students the next day, I was like, so this is what we're going to do. And I'm going to assure my chair and dean and provost will all sign off on this. I'm just going to go ahead and give you all A's. And I'm going to hope then that you spend the rest of the semester earning the grade I've already given you. And I just wonder how that would work. And I'll be applying for a position in SUNY New Paltz. 10 years not that strong. That's great. Okay. One of the issues that, well, I'll think back on to say it this way, that there is, again, as I said, the context of this power struggle, and Dr. King was very clear. And one of the things he's least known for, least apparently recognized for, are not only his stances against Vietnam, which not only made him a threat to the state, but made him a threat to his fellow civil rights leadership. Many of whom abandoned him before his life ended. So in 1966, as he starts ramping up his involvement in the northern part of the struggle, as he starts to recognize the insufficient nature of the civil rights movement as it had been carried out in the South. In fact, he uses a lot of analogies, one of which he made towards football. He said it would be like, if we stop now, it would be like taking the football and rushing into the 50-yard line and claiming touchdown. And as you saw him saying in the clip here, what we need, the changes we need won't come from a bill or a Voting Rights Act or a Civil Rights Act. These are surface level changes that are meant to mask the underlying realities that our economic system is broken. He quietly, you have to read deep into his biographies to get this, but he quietly advocated for socialism and communism. Even Vincent Harding, in his new introduction to the re-release of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he makes a point of saying that Dr. King probably didn't do enough to make clear where he was coming from in terms of his criticisms of capitalism and his criticisms of white supremacy in particular, following a tradition of many black radicals of being mostly critical not only of just white supremacy, but white liberals in particular. He was very, very, very